Dead Lions by Mick Herron, narrated by Michael Healey. A fuse had blown in Swindon, so the South-West network ground to a halt. In Paddington, the monitors wiped departure times, flagging everything delayed, and stalled trains clogged the platforms. On the concourse, luckless travellers clustered round suitcases, while seasoned commuters repaired to the pub or rang home with cast-iron alibis before hooking up with their lovers back in the city. And 36 minutes outside London, a Worcester-bound HST crawled to a halt on a bare stretch of track with a view of the Thames. Lights from the houseboats pooled on the river's surface, illuminating a pair of canoes which whipped out of sight even as Dicky Bow registered them. Two frail crafts built for speed, furrowing the water on a chilly March evening. All about, passengers were muttering, checking watches, making calls. Pulling himself into character, Dicky Bow made an exasperated but he wore no watch and had no calls to make. He didn't know where he was headed and didn't have a ticket. 3 seats away, the hood fiddled with his briefcase. The intercom fizzed. "This is your train manager. I'm sorry to have to inform you we can't go any further due to trackside equipment failure outside Swindon. We're currently—" A crackle of static and the voice died, though could faintly be heard continuing to broadcast in neighbouring carriages. Then it returned. "Reverse into Reading, where replacement buses will—" This was met with a communal groan of disgust and not a little swearing, but most impressively to Dicky Bow, immediate readiness. The message hadn't ended before coats were being pulled on and laptops folded, bags snapped shut and seats vacated. The train shunted, and then the river was flowing in the wrong direction, and Reading Station was appearing once more. There was chaos as passengers disgorged onto crowded platforms, then realized they didn't know where to go. Nor did Dicky Bow. But all he cared about was the hood, who had immediately disappeared in a sea of bodies. Dicky, though, was too old a hen to panic. It was all coming back to him. He might never have left the spook zoo. Except in those days he'd have found a patch of wall and smoked a cigarette. Not possible here, which didn't stop a nicotine pang twitching inside him, or a sudden wasp-sharp sting pricking his thigh, so real he gasped. He gripped the spot, his hand brushing first the corner of an oblivious briefcase, then an umbrella's slick, damp nastiness. Deadly weapons, he thought. Your 9-to-5ers carry deadly weapons. He was crowded onwards, like it or not, and suddenly everything was okay because he'd secured visible contact once more. The hood, a hat shielding his bald head, his case tucked under an arm, stood near the escalator to the passenger bridge. So, corralled by weary travellers, Dicky shuffled past and up the moving stairs, at the top of which he sidled into a corner. The main exit from the station was across this bridge. He assumed that was the route everyone would take once instructions about buses were issued. He closed his eyes. Today was not ordinary. Usually, by this time, just after 6:30, all sharp edges would have been smoothed away. He'd have been up since 12, after 5 hours' stormy shut-eye. Black coffee and a fag in his room, shower if needed. Then the Star, where a Guinness and whiskey chaser would either set him right or serve him notice that solids were best avoided. His hardcore days were over. Back then, he'd had his unreliable moments. Drunk, he'd mistaken nuns for whores and policemen for friends. Sober, he'd made eye contact with ex-wives. No recognition on his side, and only relief on theirs. Bad times. But even then, he'd never had a gold-standard Moscow hood shimmy past without clocking him for what he was. Dicky became aware of action. An announcement about buses had been made, and everyone was trying to cross the bridge. He hung by the monitor long enough for the hood to pass, then allowed himself to be carried forward, 3 warm bodies behind. He shouldn't be this close, but there was no accounting for the choreography of crowds. And this crowd was not happy. Having squeezed through the ticket barriers on the other side, it hassled the station staff, who placated, argued, and pointed at the exits. Outside was wet and dark, and there were no buses. The crowd swelled across the forecourt. Crushed in its embrace, Dicky Bow kept both eyes on the hood, who stood placidly waiting. An interrupted journey, thought Dickie. You played the odds in this line of work. He had forgotten he was no longer in this line of work, and the hood would have finished processing them before getting off the train. He would go with the flow, make no fuss, continue on his way by whatever means presented. Where this might be, Dickie had no idea. The train had been Worcester-bound, but made plenty of stops before then. The hood could be getting off anywhere. All Dickie knew was he'd be getting off there too. And now there were buses, 3 of them, pulling round the corner. The crowd tensed, pressed forward, and the hood sailed through the mass like an icebreaker carving an Arctic field, while Dickie slipped through spaces in his wake. Someone was calling instructions, but didn't have the voice for it. Long before he'd finished, he was drowned out by the muttering of people who couldn't hear. But the hood knew what was what. The hood was heading for the 3rd bus, so Dickie sidled through chaos in his wake and boarded it too. Nobody asked for a ticket. Dickie simply trotted on and headed for the rear, which boasted a view of the hood 2 seats ahead. Settling back, Dickie allowed his eyes to close. In every operation came a lull. When it did, you shut your eyes and took inventory. He was miles from home with about 16 quid on him. He needed a drink and wouldn't get one in a hurry. But on the upside, he was here, it was now, and he hadn't known how much he'd missed this, living life instead of easing through it on the wet stuff. Which was what he'd been doing when he'd spotted the hood, right there in the Star. A civilian's jaw would have hit the table. What the hell? A pro, even a long-defunct pro, checked the clock, drained his Guinness, folded the post, and left. Loitered by the bookies 2 doors down, remembering the last time he'd seen that face, and in whose company. The hood was a bit player. The hood had held the bottle, poured its contents directly into Dickie's clamped-wide mouth, strictly a non-speaking role. It wasn't the hood who sent electric shivers down Dickie's spine. 10 minutes later he emerged, and Dickie fell into step behind him. Dickie, who could follow a ferret through a wood, let alone a leftover ghost. A blast from the past, an echo from the Spook Zoo. Berlin, if you insisted. The Spook Zoo was Berlin, back when the cages had just been unlocked and frightened thugs were pouring from the woodwork like beetles from an upturned log. At least twice a day, some sweating would-be asset was at the door claiming to have the crown jewels in a cardboard suitcase. Defense details, missile capability, toxic secrets. And yet, for all the flurry of activity, the writing was on the newly dismantled wall. Everyone's past had been blown away, but so had Dickie Bow's future. Thanks, old chap. Afraid there's not much call for your, skills anymore. What, pension? So naturally he drifted back to London. The driver called something Dickie didn't catch. The door hissed shut and the horn was tapped twice, a farewell note to the lingering buses. Dickie rubbed his thigh where the edge of a briefcase or umbrella tip had nipped him and thought about luck and the strange places it dragged you, such as from a Soho street into the tube and out the other end, into Paddington, onto a train, then onto this bus. He still didn't know whether that luck was good or bad. When the lights went out, the bus briefly became a travelling shadow. Then passengers switched overhead bulbs on and blue screens gleamed upwards from laptops, and fists wrapped round iPhones grew spectrally white. Dickie fiddled his own phone from his pocket, but he had no messages. There were never any messages. Scrolling through his contact list, he was struck by how short it was. 2 seats in front, the hood had rolled his newspaper into a baton, wedged it between his knees, and hung his hat upon it. He might be asleep. The bus left Reading behind. Through the window, dark countryside unfurled. Some distance off, an ascending sequence of red lights indicated the mast at Didcot, but the cooling towers were invisible. In Dickie's hand, the mobile was a grenade. Rubbing his thumb on its number pad, he registered the tiny nipple on the middle button that allowed you to orient your fingers in the dark. But nobody was hanging on Dickie's words. Dickie was a relic. The world had moved on, and what would his message be anyway? That he'd seen a face from the past, and was following it home? Who would have cared? The world had moved on. It had left him behind. Rejection came softer these days. Dickie heard occasional whispers on the Soho song lines, and these days even the useless were given a chance. The service, like everyone else, was hamstrung by rules and regulations. Sack the useless, and they took you to tribunal for discriminating against useless people. So the service bunged the useless into some god-forsaken annex and threw paperwork at them, an administrative harassment intended to make them hand in their cards. They called them the slow horses, the screw-ups, the losers. They called them the slow horses, and they belonged to Jackson Lamb, whom Dickie had encountered back in the Spook Zoo. His mobile gave a blip, but there was no message, only a warning that it was running out of power. Dickie knew how it felt. He had nothing to say. Attention wavered and refocused elsewhere. Laptops hummed and mobiles whispered, but Dickie had no voice, had no movement, bar a feeble flexing of his fingers. The tiny nipple on the keypad's middle button scratched beneath his thumb. Scratch, scratch. There was an important message to deliver, but Dickie did not know what it was, nor to whom it should be sent. For a few luminous moments he was aware of being part of a warm, humid community, breathing the same air, hearing the same tune. But the tune slipped out of earshot and became beyond recall. Everything faded, save the scene through the window. The landscape continued unrolling one black fold after another, dotted with pinpricks of light like sequins on a scarf. And then the lights blurred and dimmed, and the darkness rolled over itself one final time. And then there was only the bus carrying its mortal cargo through the night, heading for Oxford, where it would deliver one soul fewer than it had gathered back in the rain. Part 1. Black Swans. Now that the roadworks had finally gone, Aldersgate Street in the London borough of Finsbury is calmer. Nowhere you'd choose to have a picnic, but no longer the vehicle-related crime scene it once resembled. The area's pulse has normalized, and while noise levels remain high, there's less pneumatic and include the occasional snatch of street music. Cars sing, taxis whistle, and locals stare in bafflement at the freely flowing traffic. Once it was wise to pack a lunch if you were heading down the street on a bus. Now you could while away half an hour trying to cross it. It's a case, perhaps, of the urban jungle reclaiming its own, and any jungle boasts wildlife if you look hard enough. A fox was spotted one mid-morning, heading from White Lion Court into the Barbican Centre, and up among the complex's flower beds and water features can be found both birds and rats. Where the greenery bends over standing water, frogs hide. After dark, there are bats. So it would be no surprise if a cat dropped in front of our eyes from one of the Barbican towers and froze as it hit the bricks, looking all directions at once without moving its head, as cats can. It's a Siamese, pale, short-haired, slant-eyed, slender and whispery, able, like all its kind, to slip through doors barely open and windows thought shut, and it's only frozen for a moment. Then it's off. It moves like a rumour, this cat, over the pedestrian bridge, then down the stairs to the station and out onto the street. A lesser cat might have paused before crossing the tributary road, but not ours. Trusting instincts, ears and speed, it's on the pavement opposite before a van driver finishes braking. And then it vanishes, or seems to. The driver peers angrily, but all he can see is a black door and a dusty recess between a newsagent's and a Chinese restaurant, its ancient black paintwork spattered with road splash, a single yellowing milk bottle on its step, and no sign of our cat, who has, of course, gone round the back. No one enters Slough House by the front door. Instead, via a shabby alleyway, its inmates let themselves into a grubby yard with mildewed walls and through a door that requires a sharp kick most mornings when damp or cold or heat have warped it. But our cat's feet are too subtle to require violence, and it's through that door in a blink and up a dog-legged flight of stairs to a pair of offices. Here on the first floor, ground level being assigned to other properties, to the new Empire Chinese, and whatever the newsagents is called this year, is where Roderick Ho labours, in an office made jungly by electrical clutter, Abandoned keyboards nest in corners, and brightly colored wires billow like loops of intestine from backless monitors. Gunmetal bookshelves hold software manuals, lengths of cable, and shoeboxes almost certainly containing oddly shaped bits of metal, while next to Ho's desk wobbles a cardboard tower fashioned from the geek's traditional building block, the empty pizza box. A lot of stuff. But when our cat pokes its head round the door, it'll find only Ho. The office is his alone, and Ho prefers this, for he mostly dislikes other people, though the fact that other people dislike him back has never occurred to him. And while Louisa Guy has been known to speculate that Ho occupies a place somewhere on the right of the autism spectrum, Min Harper has habitually responded that he's also way out there on the Git index. It's no surprise, then, that had Ho noticed our cat's presence, his response would have been to toss a Coke can at it, and he'd have been disappointed to have missed. But another thing Roderick Ho hadn't grasped about himself is that he's a better shot when aiming at stationary targets. He rarely fails to drop a can into a wastebasket half the office away, but has been known to miss the point when it's closer than that. Unscathed, then, our cat withdraws to check out the adjoining office. And here are two unfamiliar faces, recently dispatched to Slough House, one white, one black, one female, one male. So new they don't have names yet, and both thrown by their visitor. Is the cat a regular? Is the cat a fellow slow horse? Or is this a test? Troubled, they share a glance, and while they're bonding in momentary confusion, our cat slips out and nips up the stairs to the next landing and two more offices, the first of which is occupied by Min Harper and Louisa Guy. And if Min Harper and Louisa Guy had been paying attention and noticed the cat, they'd have embarrassed 7 bells out of it. Louisa would have gone onto her knees, gathered the cat in her arms, and held it to her quite impressive breasts. And here we're wandering into Min's area of opinion. Breasts that couldn't be called too small or too large, but breasts that are just right. While Min himself, if he could get his mind off of Louisa's tits long enough, would have taken a roughly manly grasp of the cat's scruff, would have tilted its head so they could share a glance and each understand the other's feline qualities, not the furry soft ones, but the nighttime grace and the walking in darkness, the predatory undercurrent that hums beneath a cat's daytime activities. Both Min and Louisa would have talked about finding milk, but neither would actually have done so, the point being to indicate that kindness and milk delivery were within both their scopes, and our cat, quite rightly, would have relieved itself on the mat before leaving the office. To enter River Cartwright's room, and while our cat would have crossed this threshold as unobtrusively as it had all the others, that wouldn't have been unobtrusive enough. River Cartwright, who was young, fair-haired, pale-skinned, with a small mole on his upper lip, would immediately have ceased what he was doing, paperwork or screen work, something involving thought rather than action, which perhaps accounts for the air of frustration that taints the air in here, and held our cat's gaze until it broke contact, made uncomfortable by such frank assessment. Cartwright wouldn't have thought about providing milk. He'd be too busy mapping the cat's actions, working out how many doors it must have slipped through to make it this far, wondering what drew it into Slough House in the first place, what motives hid behind its eyes, though even while he was thinking this, our cat would have withdrawn and made its way up the last set of stairs in search of a less stringent reckoning. And with this in mind, it would have found the first of the final pair of offices, a more welcoming area into which to strut, for this is where Catherine Standish works, and Catherine Standish knows what to do with a cat. Catherine Standish ignores cats. Cats are either adjuncts or substitutes, and Catherine Standish has no truck with either. Having a cat is one small step from having 2 cats, and to be a single woman within a syllable of 50 in possession of 2 cats is tantamount to declaring life over. Catherine Standish has had her share of scary moments, but has survived each of them and is not about to surrender now. So our cat can make itself as comfortable as it likes in here, but no matter how much affection it pretends to, how coyly it wraps its sleek length around Catherine's calves, There would be no treats forthcoming, no strips of sardine patted dry on a Kleenex and laid at its feet, no pot of cream decanted into a saucer, and since no cat worth the name can tolerate lack of worship, ours takes its leave and saunters next door. To Jackson Lamb's lair at last, where the ceiling slopes and a blind dims the window, and what light there is comes from a lamp placed on a pile of telephone directories. The air is heavy with a dog's olfactory daydream, takeaway food, illicit cigarettes, day-old farts, and stale beer, but there will be no time to catalogue this because Jackson Lamb can move surprisingly swiftly for a man of his bulk, or he can when he feels like it, and trust this, when a fucking cat enters his room, he feels like it. Within a blink he'd have seized our cat by the throat, pulled up the blind, opened the window, and dropped it to the road below, where it would doubtless land on its feet, as both science and rumour confirm, but equally doubtless in front of a moving vehicle, this, as noted, being the new dispensation on Aldersgate Street. A muffled bump and a liquid screech of brakes might have carried upwards, but Lamb would have closed the window by then and be back in his chair, eyes closed, his sausagey fingers interlinked on his paunch. It's a lucky escape for our cat, then, that it doesn't exist, for that would have been a brutal ending. And a lucky escape twice over, as it happens, for on this particular morning the nigh-on unthinkable has happened. And Jackson Lamb is not dozing at his desk or prowling the kitchen area outside his office, scavenging his underling's food, nor is he wafting up and down the staircase with that creepily silent tread he adopts at will. He's not banging on his floor, which is River Cartwright's ceiling, for the pleasure of timing how long it takes Cartwright to arrive, and he's not ignoring Catherine Standish while she delivers another pointless report he's forgotten commissioning. Simply put, he's not here. And no one in Slough House has the faintest idea where he is. Where Jackson Lamb was Oxford, and he had a brand-new theory, one to float in front of the suits at Regent's Park. Lamb's new theory was this, that instead of sending tadpole spooks on expensive torture-resistance courses at hideaways on the Welsh borders, they should pack them off to Oxford railway station to observe the staff in action, because whatever training these guys underwent, it left every last one of them highly skilled in the art of not releasing information. You work here, right? Sir? Were you on shift last Tuesday evening? The helpline number's on all the posters, sir, if you have a complaint. I don't have a complaint, Lamb said. I just want to know if you were on duty last Tuesday evening. And why would you want to know that, sir? Lamb had been stonewalled 3 times so far. This 4th was a small man with sleeked back hair and a grey moustache that twitched occasionally of its own accord. He looked like a weasel in a uniform. Lamb would have caught him by the back legs and cracked him like a whip, but there was a policeman within earshot. Let's assume it's important. He had ID, of course, under a work name, but didn't have to be a fisherman to know that you don't go lobbing rocks in the pool before you cast your line. If anyone rang the number on his card, bells and whistles would sound at Regent's Park, and Lamb didn't want the suits asking what he thought he was doing, because he wasn't sure what he thought he was doing, and there was no chance in hell he was going to share that information. Very important, he added. He twitched his lapel. A wallet poked visibly from his inside pocket, and a 20-pound note peeped visibly from inside that. Ah, I take it that's a yes. You understand we have to be careful, sir, with people asking questions at major transport hubs. Good to know, thought Jackson Lamb, that if terrorists descended on this particular transport hub, they'd meet an impregnable line of defense, unless they waved banknotes. Last Tuesday, he said, there was some kind of meltdown. But his man was already shaking his head. Not our problem, sir. Everything was fine here. Everything was fine, except the trains weren't running. The trains were running here, sir. There were problems elsewhere. Right. It had been a while since Lamb had endured a conversation this long without resorting to profanity. The slow horses would have been amazed, except the newbies, who'd have suspected a test. But wherever the problem, there were people being bussed here from Reading, because the trains weren't running. the weasel was knitting his eyebrows together, but had seen his way to the end of this line of questioning, and was picking up speed on the final stretch. "That's right, sir. A replacement bus service." "Which came from where?" "On that particular occasion, sir, I rather think they'd have come from Reading." "Of course they bloody would," Jackson Lamb sighed and reached for his cigarettes. "You can't smoke in here, sir." Lamb tucked one behind his ear. "When's the next Reading train?" 5 minutes, sir." Granting his thanks, Lamb turned for the barriers. "Sir?" He looked back. Gaze fixed on Lamb's lapel, the weasel made a rustly sign with finger and thumb. "What? I thought you were going to give you a tip." "Yes." "Okay. Here's a good one." Lamb tapped his nose with a finger. "If you've got a complaint, there's a helpline number on the posters." Then he wandered onto the platform and waited for his train. Back on Aldersgate Street, the two new horses in the first-floor office were sizing each other up. They'd arrived a month back within the same fortnight, both exiled from Regent's Park, the service's heart and moral high ground. Slough House, which was not its real name, it didn't have a real name, was openly acknowledged to be a dumping ground. Assignment here was generally temporary because those assigned here usually quit before long. That was the point of sending them, to light a sign above their heads reading "Exit." Slow horses they were called, Slough House, Slow Horse, a wordplay based on a joke whose origins were almost forgotten. These two, who have names now, their names are Marcus Longridge and Shirley Dander, have known each other by sight in their previous incarnations, but department culture kept a firm grip on Regent's Park, and ops and comms were different fish and swam in different circles. So now, in the way of newbies everywhere, they were as suspicious of each other as of the more established residents. Still, the service world was relatively small, and stories often circled it twice before smoke from the wreckage subsided. So Marcus Longridge, mid-40s, black, South London-born of Caribbean parents, knew what had propelled Shirley Dander from Regent's Park communications sector, and Dander, who was in her 20s and vaguely Mediterranean-looking, Scottish great-grandmother, nearby POW camp, Italian internee on day release, had heard rumours about Longridge's meltdown-related counselling sessions, but neither had spoken to the other of this or indeed of much else yet. Their days had been filled with the minutiae of office co-living and a slow-burn loss of hope. It was Marcus who made the first move, and this was a single word. So. It was late morning. London weather was undergoing a schizoid attack, sudden shafts of sunlight highlighting the grimy window glass, sudden flurries of rain failing to do much to clean it. So what? So here we are. Shirley Dander was waiting for her computer to reboot. Again. It was running face recognition software comparing glimpses snatched from CCTV coverage at troop withdrawal rallies with photo-fit images of suspected jihadists. That is, jihadists suspected of existing. Jihadists who had code names and everything, but might have been rumored into being by inept intelligence work. While the program was 2 years out of date, it wasn't as out of date as her PC, which resented the demands placed upon it and had made this known 3 times so far this morning. Without looking up, she said, "Is this a chat-up?" "I wouldn't dare, because that would not be wise." "I've heard." "Well then." For almost a minute that was that. Shirley could feel her watch ticking, could feel through the desk's surface the computer struggling to return to life, 2 pairs of feet tracked downstairs, Harper and Guy. She wondered where they were off to. "So, given that it's not a chat-up, is it okay if we talk?" "About what?" "Anything." Now she gave him a hard stare. Marcus Longridge shrugged. "Like it or not, we're sharing. It wouldn't hurt if we said more than shut the door." "I've never told you to shut the door. Or whatever. Actually, I prefer it open. It feels less like a prison cell." "That's good," said Marcus. "See, we've got a discussion going. Spent much time in prison?" "I'm not in the mood, okay?" He shrugged. "Okay. But there's 6 and something hours of the working day left, and 20 years of the working life. We could spend it in silence if you'd rather, but one of us will go mad and the other will go crazy. He bent back to his computer. Downstairs, the back door slammed. Shirley's screen swam bluely into life, thought about it, and crashed again. Now conversation had been attempted. Its absence screamed like a fire alarm. Her wristwatch pulsed. There was nothing she could do about it. The words had to be said. "Speak for yourself," he said. "About?" 20 years of working life." "Right. More like 40 in my case." Marcus nodded. It didn't show on his face, but he felt triumph. He knew a beginning when he heard one. In Reading, Jackson Lamb had tracked down the station manager for whose benefit he adopted a fussy, donnish air. It wasn't hard to believe Lamb an academic, shoulders dusted with dandruff, green V-neck stained by misjudged mouthfuls of takeaway, frayed shirt cuffs poking from overcoat sleeves. He was overweight, from sitting around in libraries probably, and his thinning, dirty blonde hair was brushed back over his head. The stubble on his cheeks sang of laziness, not cool. He'd been said to resemble Timothy Spall, with worse teeth. The station manager directed him to the company which supplied replacement buses, and 10 minutes later Lamb was doing fussy academic again, this time with a bottom note of grief. "My brother," he said. Oh, sorry to hear that." Lamb waved a forgiving hand. "No, that's awful. I'm really sorry. We hadn't spoken in years." "Oh, well, that makes it worse, doesn't it?" Lamb, who had no opinion, gave assent. It does. His eyes clouded as he recalled an imaginary infant episode in which two brothers enjoyed a moment of absolute fraternal loyalty, little knowing that the years to come would drive a wedge between them, that they would not speak during middle age, which would come to a halt for one of them on a bus in dark Oxfordshire, where he would succumb to— heart attack, was it? Unable to speak, Lamb nodded. The depot manager shook his head sadly. It was a bad business, and not much of an advert. A customer dying on a unit, though then again it wasn't as if liability lay with the company. Apart from anything else, the corpse hadn't been in possession of a valid ticket. I wondered— Yes? Which bus was it? Is it here now? There were 4 coaches in the yard, another 2 in the sheds, and as it happened, the depot manager knew precisely which one had unintentionally doubled as a hearse, and it was parked not 10 yards away. "Only I'd like to sit in it for a moment," Lamb said, where he sat, you know. "I'm not sure what— It's not that I believe in a life force precisely," Lamb explained, tremor in his voice, "but I'm not positive I don't believe in it. Do you see what I mean?" "Oh, of course. And if I could just sit where he was sitting when he passed, well—" Unable to continue, he turned to gaze over the brick wall enclosing the yard and beyond the office block opposite. A pair of Canada geese were making their way riverwards, their plaintive honking underlining Lamb's sadness. Or that's how it seemed to the depot manager. "There," he said, "it's that one over there." Abandoning his scanning of the skies, Lamb fixed him with wide and innocent gratitude. Shirley Dander tapped a pencil uselessly against her reluctant monitor, then put it down. As it hit the desk, she made a plosive noise with her lips. "What?" "What's wouldn't dare supposed to mean?" she said. "I don't follow." "When I asked if you were chatting me up, you said you wouldn't dare." Marcus Longridge said, "I heard the story." That figured, she thought. Everyone had heard the story. Shirley Dander was 5'2", brown eyes, olive skin, and a full mouth she didn't smile with much. Broad in the shoulder and wide in the hip, she favored black. Black jeans, black tops, black trainers. Once, in her hearing, it had been suggested she had the sex appeal of a traffic bollard, a comment delivered by a notorious sexual incompetent. On the day she was assigned to Slough House, she'd had a buzz cut she'd refreshed every week since. That she had inspired obsession was beyond doubt, specifically a 4th desk comms operative at Regent's Park, who had pursued her with a diligence which took no heed of the fact that she was in a relationship. He'd taken to leaving notes on her desk, to calling her lover's flat at all hours. Given his job, he had no trouble making these calls untraceable. Given hers, she had no trouble tracing them. There were protocols in place, of course, a grievance procedure which involved detailing inappropriate behaviors and evidencing disrespectful attitudes, guidelines which carried little weight with staff who'd spent a minimum of 8 weeks on assault training as part of their probation. After a night in which he'd called 6 times, he'd approached her in the canteen to ask how she'd slept, and Shirley had decked him with one clean punch. She might have got away with this if she hadn't hauled him to his feet and decked him again with a second. Issues was the verdict from HR. It was clear that Shirley Dander had issues. Marcus was talking through her thoughts. Everybody heard the story, man. Someone told me his feet left the floor. Only the first time. You were lucky not to get shit-canned. You reckon? Point taken. But mixing it on the hub? Guys have been sacked for less. Guys, maybe, she said. Sacking a girl for flattening a creep who's harassing her, that's embarrassing. Especially if the girl in question wants to get legal about it. The inverted commas round girl couldn't have been more audible if she'd said, quote, unquote. Besides, I had an edge. What sort of edge? She kicked back from her desk with both feet and her chair legs squealed on the floor. What are you after? Nothing. Because you sound pretty curious for someone just making conversation. Well, he told her, without curiosity, what kind of conversation have you got? She studied him. He wasn't bad-looking for his age, and what appeared to be a lazy left eyelid, but this gave him a watchful air as if he were constantly sizing the world up. His hair was longer than hers, but not by much. He wore a neatly trimmed beard and moustache, and was careful how he dressed. Today this meant well-pressed jeans and a white collarless shirt under a grey jacket. His black and purple Nicole Farhi scarf hung on the coat stand. She'd noticed all this not because she cared, but because everything was information. He didn't wear a wedding ring, but that meant nothing. Besides, everyone was divorced or unhappy. Okay, she said, but if you're playing me, you're likely to find out firsthand just how hard I hit. He raised his hands in not entirely mock surrender. Hey, I'm just trying to establish a working relationship, you know, us being the newbies. It's not like the others put up a united front, except maybe Harper and Guy. They don't have to, Marcus said. They've got resident status. His fingers played a quick trill across his keyboard, then he pushed it away and shunted his chair sideways. What do you make of them? As a group, or one by one, doesn't have to be a seminar. Where do we start? Marcus Longridge said, We start with Lamb. Perched on the back seat of a bus where a man had died, Jackson Lamb was looking out at a cracked concrete forecourt and a pair of wooden gates, beyond which lay Reading town centre. As a long-time Londoner, Lamb couldn't contemplate this without a shudder. For the moment, though, he concentrated on doing what he was pretending to do, which was sit in quiet recall of the man he'd said was his brother, but who in reality had been Dickie Bow. Too daft to be a work name, but too cute to be real. Dickie and Lamb had been in Berlin at the same time, but from this distance Lamb had trouble recalling the other man's face. The image he kept coming up with was sleek and pointy, like a rat. But then that's what Dickie Bow had been, a street rat, adept at crawling through holes too small for him. That had been his survival skill. It didn't appear to have helped him lately. A heart attack, the post-mortem had said. Not especially surprising in a man who drank as much and smoked as much and ate as much fried food as Dickie Bow. Uncomfortable reading for Lamb, whose habits it might have been describing. Reaching out, he traced a finger over the back of the seat in front. Its surface was mostly smooth, the one burn mark obviously ancient, the faint tracery in a corner suggesting random scratching rather than an attempt to etch a dying message. It was years since Bow had been in the service, and even then He'd been one of that great army who'd never quite been inside the tent. You could always trust a street rat, the wisdom ran, because every time one of them took money from the other side, he'd be on your doorstep next morning expecting you to match the offer. There was no brotherhood code. If Dickie Bow had succumbed to a mattress fire, Lamb would have got through the 5 stages without batting an eye: denial, anger, bargaining, indifference, breakfast. But Bow had died on the back seat of a moving coach without a ticket in his pocket. Booze, fags, and fry-ups aside, the PM couldn't explain Bow's being in the sticks when he should have been working his shift at a Soho pawn shop. Standing, Lamb ran a hand along the overhead rack and found nothing. Even if he had, it wouldn't have been anything left by Dickie Bow, not after 6 days. Then he sat again and studied the rubber lining along the base of the window, looking for scratch marks. Ridiculous perhaps, but Moscow rules meant assuming your mail was read. When you needed to leave a message, you left it by other means, though in this instance a thumbnail on a rubber lining wasn't one of them. A hesitant, polite cough from the front of the coach. Lamb looked up mournfully. I don't mean to rush you, but are you going to be much longer? 1 minute, Lamb said. Actually, he needed less than that. Even while he was speaking, he was sliding his hand down the back of the seat, forcing it between the 2 cushions, encountering a gobbet of ancient chewing gum hardened to a tumour on the fabric, a welter of biscuit crumbs, a paper clip, a coin too small to be worth pocketing, and the edge of something hard which squirted out of his reach, forcing him to delve deeper, the cuff of his overcoat riding up his arm as he pushed, and there it was again, a smooth plastic shell snuggling into his grip. Lamb scratched his wrist deep enough to draw blood as he pulled his treasure free, but didn't notice. All his attention was focused on his prize, an old, fat, bottom-of-the-line mobile phone. Lamb? Well, Lamb's everything he's made out to be, which is some kind of fat bastard who goes way back. A long-lived fat bastard, the worst kind. He sits upstairs and craps on the rest of us. It's like he gets pleasure out of running a department full of losers. You calling me a loser? We're both here, aren't we? Work was forgotten. Marcus Longridge, having just called Shirley Dander a loser, gave her a bright smile. She paused, wondering what she was getting into. Trust nobody, she decided when she'd first set foot in this place. The buzz cut was part of that. Trust nobody. And here she was on the verge of opening up to Marcus simply because he was the one she was sharing an office with. And what was he smiling at? Did he think he was being friendly? Take a deep breath, she told herself, but a mental one. Don't let him see. This was the crux of communications. Find out all you can, but give nothing away. She said, The jury's still out on that. What do you make of him anyway? Well, he's running his own department. Some department? More like a charity shop. She slapped a hand on her PC. This should be in a museum for a start. We're supposed to catch bad guys with this shit. We'd have a better chance standing on Oxford Street with a clipboard. Excuse me, sir, are you a terrorist? Sir or miss, Marcus corrected her. Then said, We're not expected to catch anyone. We're supposed to get bored and go join a security firm. But the point is, whatever we're here for, Lamb's not being punished. Or if he is, he's enjoying it. So what's your point? He said, That he knows where some bodies are buried, probably buried a few himself. Is that a metaphor? I failed English. Metaphor's a closed book to me. So you think he's handy? Well, he's overweight and drinks and smokes, and I doubt he takes much exercise that doesn't involve picking up a phone and calling out for a curry. But yeah, now you mention it, I think he's handy. He might have been once, Shirley said, but there's not much point at being handy if you're too slow to be any good at it. But Marcus disagreed. Being handy was a state of mind. Lamb could wear you down just standing in front of you, and you wouldn't know he was a threat until he was walking away, and you were wondering who'd turned the lights out. Just Marcus's opinion, of course. He'd been wrong before. I suppose, he said, if we stick around long enough we might find out. Coming back down the coach, Lamb rubbed a finger in his eye, which made him look grieving, or at any rate like he had a sore eye. The depot manager seemed uncomfortable, ill at ease with a stranger's sorrow, or else he'd noticed Lamb with his arm down the back seat and was wondering whether to address the topic. To short-circuit any such attempt, Lamb said, "The driver around?" "What? Who was driving when?" "When my brother kicked off, yes," but he just nodded and wiped his eye again. The driver didn't much want to talk to Lamb about his uncooperative passenger. The only good ones are the ones that walk away, being the standard bus driver take on the general public. But once the depot manager had made a final apology and shuffled back to his office, and Lamb had indicated for the second time that morning that he had a £20 note in his possession, the driver opened up. "What can I say? Sorry for your loss." Though seemed happy enough about his own possible gain. Lamb said, "Was he talking to anyone, did you notice?" "We're supposed to keep our eyes on the road, mostly." "Before you started?" The driver said, "What can I say?" Again, "It was a bleeding circus, mate. Couple of thousand stranded, we were just getting them shifted, so no, I didn't notice, sorry. He was just another punter until, Realizing he was heading up a conversational cul-de-sac, he tailed off with, "You know." "Until you got to Oxford with a stiff on your back seat," Lamb supplied helpfully. "He must have gone peaceful," the driver said. "I pretty much kept to the limit." Lamb looked back at the coach. The company livery was red and blue, its lower half flecked with mud. Just an ordinary vehicle that Dickie Bowe had stepped on and never stepped off again. "Was there anything unusual about that trip?" he asked. The driver stared. Corpse aside. "Sorry, mate, it was just, pick him up at the station, drop him off at Oxford, not like it was the first time." "And what happened when you got there, Oxford?" "Oh, most of them was off like the clappers. There was a train waiting to take them the rest of the way. They must have been an hour behind by then, and it was pissing down, so they wasn't hanging around." "But someone found the body." The driver gave him an odd look, and Lamb surmised the reason. "Richard," he said. They'd been brothers, hadn't they? "Dickie. Someone realized he was dead." There was a huddle at the back of the bus, but he was already gone. One of them, a doctor, he stayed behind, but the rest left to catch their train. He paused. "He looked quite calm-like, your brother." It's how he would have wanted to go," Lamb assured him. He liked buses. "So you, called an ambulance?" "He was past help, but yeah, I was stuck there rest of the evening. No offence, had to give a statement, but you'd know that, right, being his brother?" "That's right," Lamb said, being his brother. "Anything else happen?" "Business as normal, mate. Once he'd been, taken away and I'd tidied the bus and everything, I came back here." "Tidied the bus?" "Not cleaning it or anything, just checked the seats for anything left behind, wallets and that." "And did you find anything?" "Not that evening, mate. Well, just a hat." "A hat?" "On the overhead rack, near where your brother was." "What sort of hat?" "Black one." "Black one what? Bowler? Fedora? What?" He shrugged. "Just a hat, with a brim, "Where is it now?" "Lost property. Unless it's been picked up. It was just a hat. People leave hats on buses all the time." Not when it's pissing down, they don't, thought Lamb. A moment's reflection told him this wasn't true. When it was raining, more people wore hats, or more people left them on buses. It stood to reason, a matter of statistics. But the thing about statistics, Lamb reasoned, was statistics could take a flying hump at the moon. "So where's your lost property?" he waved in the vague direction of the depot office. "Over there?" "No, mate, back in Oxford, innit?" "Of bloody course it is," thought Lamb. "So what about Ho?" "Ho's a dweeb." "Newsflash, all webheads are dweebs." "Ho's dweebness goes deeper." "You want to know the first thing he said to me?" "What?" "The very first thing, right? I haven't even got my coat off," Marcus said. "First morning here, thinking I've been shipped to the spooks equivalent of Devil's Island, and I'm wondering what happens next, and Ho picks up his coffee mug and shows it to me. It's got a picture of Clint Eastwood on it, and he says, 'This is my mug, okay? and I don't like other people using my mug. Shirley said, "Okay, that's dweebdom, and then some. It's way past anal. I bet his socks are tagged left and right." "What about Guy?" "She's doing Harper." "Harper? He's doing Guy." "I'm not saying you're wrong, but that hardly amounts to a character portrait." He shrugged. "They've not been doing each other long, so right now that's the only significant thing about them." Shirley said, "That must have been them going out earlier. I wonder where they went." "We're still persona non grata at the park, then?" Which was an odd thing for Min Harper to say, given that they were in a park, but Louisa Guy knew what he meant. "Do you know," she said, "I'm not entirely sure that's the reason." The park they were in was St. James's, and the park they weren't in was Regent's. They were heading for the palace end, and a woman in a pink velvety tracksuit was approaching them along the footpath at about 2 miles an hour. At her ankles waddled a small, hairy dog with a matching pink ribbon round its neck. They waited until she'd passed before continuing. "Explain?" So Louisa did. It was to do with Leonard Bradley. Until recently, Bradley had been chair of the Limitations Committee, which effectively controlled the service purse strings. Every op planned by Ingrid Tierney, first desk at Regent's Park, had to be cleared by Limitations if she didn't want budgeting issues, which was what running out of money was now called. Except Bradley, Sir Leonard, if the title hadn't been repossessed yet, had lately been caught with his fingers in the till. A Shropshire safe house, fully staffed for the recuperation of officers suffering service-related stress, had turned out to be a beachfront property on the Maldives, though to be fair it was fully staffed, and the result of Bradley's peccadillos. "How do you know all this?" Harper interrupted. "I thought he'd just retired." "Ah, that's sweet. But you've got to keep an ear to the ground in this business." "Don't tell me, Catherine." She nodded. "Girls' talk? Quick confab in the ladies?" He kept it light, but there was an edge. Something he was excluded from. She said, "Catherine's hardly likely to call a press conference. When I told her we'd been summoned, she told me this was going on. She called it an audit." "How does she know about it?" Louisa said, "She's got a connection, one of the queens." The queens of the database were who you went to when you needed information, which made them useful friends and even more useful connections. So what's this audit? And the result of Bradley's peccadillos was what was being termed an audit, but might more accurately be called an inquisition. Limitations' new chair, Roger Barrowby, was taking the opportunity to clean the stables. This involved in-depth interviews with all staff, covering their financial, operational, emotional, psychological, sexual, and medical histories, just to make sure everything was squeaky clean. Nobody wanted further embarrassments. "Bit of a cheek," Min said. "I mean, Bradley was the one stealing cookies. Any embarrassment should be the committee's, not the park's." "Welcome to the world, baby boy," Louisa explained. There was a bright side, though. "I bet Taverner's going spare," he mused. But there wasn't time to explore what Taverner might be going, because here came James Webb, who'd summoned them to this alfresco meeting. Webb was a suit. He wasn't actually wearing a suit today. He wore fawn chinos and a double blue roll neck under a black raincoat. But he wasn't fooling anyone. He was a suit, and if you cut him open, he'd bleed in pinstripes. Today's outfit he probably thought was tradecraft, what you wore for a leafy stroll. But the impression he gave was that he'd popped along to his man in Jermyn Street, explained he was going for a walk in the park, and wanted to dress accordingly. He was as much a man in casuals as the Pink Lady was a jogger. Still, he was Regent's Park to their Slough house. Getting the call at all was a jaw-dropper. When he nodded, they nodded back, and fell into step either side of him. "Any trouble getting away?" He might have been asking how traffic had been. Louisa said, "The back door jams. You have to kick it and lean on the handle at the same time." Once we were through that, it was a breeze. Webb said, "I meant with Lamb." Lamb wasn't round, Min told him. Is he not supposed to know about this? Oh, he'll find out eventually. It's no big deal anyway. I'm seconding you, that's all. Not for long. 3 weeks or so. I'm seconding you, like he was a big wheel, over at the park, where Ingrid Tierney was in D.C., which was about half the time. Lady Di Taverner took the hot seat. She was one of several second desks, but top of most people's list whenever there were rumors of a palace coup. As for Spider Webb, his desk didn't have a number. He was basically HR. Min and Louisa had heard and had this connection with River Cartwright neither of them knew the details of, beyond that they'd been through training together and that Webb had screwed River over, which was how come River was a slow horse. Maybe some of this leaked out from Min and Louisa's silence because Webb said, "So you'll be reporting to me." "On what sort of job?" "Babysitting. Maybe a bit of vetting." "Vetting?" Vetting was mostly clerical, which was the slow horse's lot, but demanded resources Slough House didn't run to. And anyway, usually felt a background. Regent Park's skeleton rattling department with the dogs, the internal security mob providing backup as and when. But Webb affected to believe Min was unfamiliar with the term. Yes, personal checks, identity confirmation, location cleansing, that sort of thing. "Oh, vetting," said Min. "Thought you said petting. I wondered if things were getting heavy." "It's not complicated," Webb said, "because if it was, I wouldn't be asking a smart-ass to do it. But if you're not up to it, just say the word." He came to a halt, and Min and Louisa each took an extra step before realizing. They turned to face him. He said, "And then you can piss off back to Slough House on whatever important tasks you're busy with this week." Min's mouth began responding before his brain was in gear, but Louisa got in first. "We've nothing much on," she said. "We'd be up for it." She shot Min a glance. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds like a blast." "A blast?" "Within our sphere of competence, he means," Louisa said. "We're just a little nonplussed by your choice of venue." Webb looked around, as if only just noticing they were outside. Water, trees, birds. Traffic, aware of the palace, hummed politely beyond the railings. "Yes," he said. "Well, always nice to get out." "Especially when things are dodgy at home," Min couldn't stop himself saying. Louisa shook her head. "I have to work with this?" But Webb pursed his lips. "It's true the park's a bit manic right now." "Yeah, you're touching toes for the bean counters," thought Min. "That must make for fun moments round the water cooler." Webb said, "Every organization needs the odd shake-up. We'll see how things stand once the dust settles." And in the same instant, both Min and Louisa realized Webb was intending to emerge from this shake-up behind a desk with a number on it. But meanwhile, it's mend and make do. Background's busy, as you might imagine, running checks on the park's own staff, which is why we find ourselves forced to, outsource, if you like. "Tell us about this babysitting," Louisa suggested. "We're expecting visitors," Webb said. "What kind?" "The Russian kind." "That's nice. Aren't they our friends now?" Webb chuckled politely. "What's the occasion?" "Talks about talks." "Guns, oil, or money?" Min asked. "Cynicism's an overrated quality, don't you think?" Webb marched onwards, and they fell into step, flanking him. "HMG rather feels the wind of change from the east. Nothing imminent, but you have to prepare for the future. Always an idea to extend a friendly hand to those who might one day be, influential." "Oil, then," Min said. "So who's the visitor?" Louisa asked. "Name of Pashkin. Like the poet?" "Very nearly like the poet, yes. Arkady Pashkin. A century ago he'd have been a warlord. 20 years ago, mafia." Webb paused. Well, 20 years ago he was mafia, probably. But these days he's mostly a billionaire. "And you want us to vet him?" "Christ, no. The man owns an oil company. He could have whole bloody boneyards in his closet. HMG wouldn't care. But he'll be bringing staff, and there'll be high-level talks, and all of this needs to run smoothly. If it doesn't, well, the park will obviously need someone to blame. And that would be us? That would be you." He gave a brief smile which might have indicated humor, but neither Min nor Louisa were convinced. "Any problems with that?" "Sounds like nothing we can't handle," Min said. "I'd hope not." Webb came to a halt again. Min was starting to have flashbacks to walking his two boys when they were younger. Getting anywhere was a struggle. Anything in their path that snagged their interest, a twig, a rubber band, a till receipt, resulted in a 5-minute delay. So Webb went on too casually. "How's things over your manor, then?" "Our manor?" Min wanted to parrot. "In it." Louisa said, "Same old, same old." "And Cartwright?" "No different." "I'm surprised he sticks it out. No offence, but he was always full of himself. He must hate it over there, away from the action." There was barely disguised satisfaction in the pronouncement. Min had decided he wasn't a fan of Spider Webb. He wasn't a particular fan of River Cartwright, come to that, but there was a baseline these days that hadn't always been there, and it was simply stated. Cartwright was a slow horse, same as himself, same as Louisa. Once, that hadn't meant more than being tarred with the same brush, but now if they didn't stick together exactly, they didn't piss on each other in front of others. Or not in front of Regent's Park suits, anyway. He said, "I'll pass on your regards. I know he has fond memories of your last meeting." At which River had clubbed Webb unconscious. Louisa said, "Does Lamb know you're, seconding us?" "He will soon. Is he likely to kick up a fuss?" "Well," Louisa said, "if it pisses him off, I'm sure he'll keep it to himself." "Yeah," Min said. "You know Lamb. Natural-born diplomat." "Oh, Christ," said Lamb, "not you again." Back at Oxford Station, another half-hour wait for a train, Lamb was looking for someone to tell him where the lost property office was, and the first face he saw was the Weasels. Still twitchy, still officious, and definitely not happy to cast eyes on Jackson Lamb. He made to walk straight past, but Lamb's cover as just another member of the public was wearing thin. He caught hold of a uniformed elbow. "A word?" The Weasel looked down at Lamb's hand, up at Lamb's face, and then, slowly, deliberately, at the transport policeman a few yards away, showing a pretty blonde woman how to read a map. Lamb released his grip. "If it's of any interest," he said, "I still have that £20 note." In the teeth of the expectations of a Reading bus driver, he might have added, "So there's no reason we can't proceed in a friendly fashion." He smiled to illustrate friendly fashion, though the yellow-stained result might have passed for evil intent. It was more probably the mention of money than the amiable overture that worked. "What is it this time?" the Weasel asked. "Lost property. Where is it?" "That would be in the lost property office." "Oh, this is going splendidly," Lamb said. "And where's that?" The Weasel pursed his lips and looked pointedly at the spot where Lamb's wallet nestled in his inside pocket. It was clear that mere promises were no longer cutting ice. Finishing his geography lesson, the policeman glanced across. Lamb nodded at him and received a similar nod back. Then he asked the Weasel, "Worked here long?" 19 years, the Weasel said. His tone suggested this was something to be proud of. "Well, if you want to make it to 19 years in a day, start playing nice. Because I've spent 19 years and then some finding things out people don't want me to know, so a bit of publicly available information from a turd in a uniform really shouldn't be this hard to acquire, don't you think?" The Weasel looked round for the policeman, who was now ambling towards a coffee booth. "Oh, seriously," Lamb said, "can he get here before I break your nose?" Nothing in his physical appearance suggested Lamb could move quickly, but something about his presence suggested you'd be unwise to dismiss the possibility. He watched this calculation crawl across the Weasel's face, and, while it was struggling to its conclusion, yawned ferociously. When lions yawn, it doesn't mean they're tired, it means they're waking up. The Weasel said, "Platform 2. "Lead the way," Lamb said. "I'm looking for a hat." In St. James's Park, Webb had handed over a pink cardboard folder, its flap sealed with a sticky label, and taken his leave. Louisa and Min were now heading for the city, but they were walking round the lake first in case this turned out to be a shortcut. "If he'd said HMG once more, I'd have had to LOL," Louisa said. What? Oh, right, good one. Sounded miles away. The wheel is turning, she noted, but the hamster's dead. Min proved her point by grunting in reply. She took his arm because they could always pretend this was cover. On a rock in the middle of the lake, a pelican stretched its wings. It was like watching a golf umbrella do aerobics. She said, "You've been eating your Wheaties, haven't you?" Meaning what? I thought you were going to challenge him into a wrestling match. This earned a sheepish grin. Yeah, well, he got on my tits. Louisa smiled, but kept it on the inside. Min had changed these past few months, and she was aware that she was the cause of it. On the other hand, she was equally aware that any woman would have done. Min was having sex again, and that would put a spring in anyone's step. Like Herron, his life had gone down the pen a few years back. In Min's case, the pivotal moment had been leaving a classified disc on a tube train. His marriage had been collateral damage. As for Louisa, she'd screwed up a tail job, an error which had put guns on the street. But a few months ago they'd stirred themselves out of their individual torpors enough to start an affair. At the same time, Slough House had gone briefly live. Things had settled since, but optimism hadn't entirely died. They suspected Jackson Lamb now had serious dope on Diana Taverner, enough that, if she wasn't his sock puppet, she was at least in his debt. And debt meant power. Louisa said, "Webb's the one River put on the floor, isn't he?" "That's right." "I'm surprised he got up again." Min said, "You think River's that tough?" "Don't you?" "Not especially." She barked a little laugh. "What?" "You, that shoulder roll you gave when you said that," she gave an exaggerated imitation, like, "not as tough as me." "I did not." "Yes, you did." She gave the roll again. "Like that. Like you were on World's Strongest Man or something." "I did not. And all I meant was, sure, River can probably handle himself. But he's hardly likely to dismantle Lady Di's lapdog, is he?" "Depends what the lapdog did to him." They rounded the lake, padding about on the grass on feet too big for their legs, where two annoying birds neither could identify, while a short distance away a black swan glided. It looked cross. "You okay with this?" She shrugged. "Babysitting? Hardly high excitement. Gets us out of the office. When it's not keeping us there. There'll be paperwork. Wonder what Lam'll say." Min stopped, so Louisa, her arm still through his, came to a halt too. Together they watched the swan patrol the choppy fringe of the lake and jab without warning at something below the surface, its neck momentarily becoming a bar of black light beneath the water. She said, "Black swans, I was reading about them the other day." "What, they're on a takeaway menu? That's kind of sick." "Behave." It was in one of the Sundays. "It's a phrase, black swan," she said. "Means a totally unexpected event with a big impact, but one that seems predictable afterwards with the benefit of hindsight." They walked on. After a while, Louisa said, "So what were you thinking back then, when you were so far away?" He said, "I was thinking last time we got dragged into a Regent's Park op, someone was looking to screw us over." The black swan dipped its neck once more and buried its head in the water. Shirley Dander lifted her take-out coffee cup, found it cold, and drank from it anyway, then said, "Standish?" "The Lady Catherine," Marcus made a swigging gesture with his right hand. "She likes the bottle." That didn't sound right. Catherine Standish was wound pretty tight, and with her curiously old-fashioned way of dressing resembled Alice in Wonderland, grown middle-aged and disappointed. But Marcus seemed sure. "She's dry now, years probably. But if I know drunks, and I've known a few, she could have put me under the table in her day. You too, sequentially." "You make her sound like a boxer." "Your really serious drunk approaches booze like it was a bar fight. You know, only one of you's going to be left standing, and the drunk always thinks that'll be him. Her, in this case. But now she's hung up her drinking shoes. They all think they've done that too. Cartwright? He crashed King's Cross." "Huh, I know. I saw the movie." Video footage of River Cartwright's disastrous assessment exercise, which had caused a rush-hour panic in one of London's major railway stations, was occasionally used for training purposes, to Cartwright's less than delight. "His grandfather's some kind of legend, David Cartwright?" "Before my time." "He's Cartwright's grandfather," Marcus said. "He's before all our times. But he was a spook back in the Dark Ages. Still alive, mind." "Just as well," Shirley said. "He'd be turning in his grave otherwise, Cartwright being a slow horse and all." Marcus Longridge pushed further back from his desk and stretched his arms wide. He could block doorways, Shirley thought. Probably had, back in Ops. He'd been on raids, had closed down an active terrorist cell a year or so back. That was the story, anyway. But there must have been another story, too, or he wouldn't be here now. He was staring at her. His eyes were blacker than his skin, a thought that reached her unprompted. "What? What was your edge?" "My edge, huh?" "That meant they couldn't sack you." "I know what you meant." Somewhere overhead, a chair scraped on a floor, footsteps crossed to a window. "I told them I was gay," she said at last. "Uh-huh." "And no way they were going to fire a dyke for punching out some arsehole who felt her up in the canteen." "Is that why you cut your hair?" "No," she said. "I cut my hair because I felt like it." "Are we on the same side?" "I'm on nobody's side but my own." He nodded. "Suit yourself." "I intend to." She turned back to her monitor, which had fallen asleep. When she shifted her mouse, it grumpily revealed a screen frozen on a split image of two faces, so obviously not a match that the program must have been taking the piss. "So, are you actually gay, or did you just tell them that?" Shirley didn't reply. On a bench at Oxford Station sat Jackson Lamb, overcoat swamping him either side, undone shirt button allowing a hairy glimpse of stomach. He scratched this absently, then fumbled with the button before giving up and covering the mound instead with a black fedora, on which he then concentrated his gaze as if it held the secret of the Grail. A black hat, left on a bus, the bus Dickie Bow had died on, which didn't in itself mean much, but Jackson Lamb wondered. It had been raining heavily when that bus reached Oxford, and first thing you do on stepping off a bus into the rain was put your hat on, if you had one. And if you didn't have one, first thing you do was go back for it. Unless you didn't want to draw attention to yourself, wanted to remain part of the crowd heading onto the platform, boarding a train, being carried away from the scene as quickly as possible. He was being stared at, pointedly, by a woman who was far too attractive to be doing so out of amateur interest. Except, Lamb realized, it wasn't him she was staring at, but the cigarette he now noticed he held between two fingers of his left hand, the one he was tapping the fedora with. His right was already rummaging for a lighter, a motion not dissimilar from scratching his balls. He gave her his best crooked smile, which involved flaring one nostril, and she responded by flaring both her own and looking away. But he tucked the fag behind his ear anyway. The rummaging hand gave up search for a lighter and found instead the mobile phone he'd collected from the bus. It was an ancient thing, a Nokia, black and grey with about as many functions as a bottle opener. You could no more take a photo with it than send an email with a stapler. But when he pressed the button, the screen squeaked into life and let him scroll down a contact list. 5 numbers, Shop, Diggs and Star, which sounded like Beau's local, and 2 actual names, a Dave and a Lisa, both of which Lamb rang. Dave's mobile went straight to voicemail. Lisa's landline went nowhere, was a gateway to a humming void in which no telephone would ever be answered. He clicked onto messages and found only a note from Beau's service provider informing him he had 82p in his pay-as-you-go account. Lamb wondered what fraction of Beau's worldly goods 82p represented. Maybe he could send Lisa a check. He scrolled onto sent items. That was empty too. But Dickie Bow had fished his mobile out shortly before dying and had jammed it between the cushions of his seat, as if to make sure it would only be found by someone looking for it, by someone for whom he had a message. An unsent message, as it turned out. A train arrived, but Lamb remained on his bench. Not many people got off, not many people got on. As it pulled away, Lamb saw the attractive young woman glowering at him through a window, and he farted quietly in response. A private victory, but satisfying. Then he examined the phone again. Drafts. There was a drafts folder for text messages. He opened this, and the single-word entry of a single saved message stared back from the tiny screen. Near his feet, a pigeon scratched the ground in imitation of a bird that might make an effort. Lamb didn't notice. He was absorbed in that single word, keyed into the phone but never transmitted, locked forever in its black and grey box alongside 82 pence worth of unused communication. As if a dying word could be breathed into a bottle and corked up and released once the grim business of tidying away the corpse had been seen to. Here on an Oxfordshire railway platform, with a late March sun struggling to make itself felt, and a fat pigeon tramping underfoot. One word. Cicadas. Jackson Lamb said out loud, then said it again. Cicadas. And then he said, "Fuck me."